Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen SACKUR. In just a few days' time, the UK Parliament will make a fateful decision to accept or reject Theresa May's Brexit deal, painfully negotiated with the EU. Right across Europe, the vote will have huge repercussions. For all of the focus on Britain's political crisis, this is Europe's problem too. My guest is Danuta HUBNER, an influential Polish MEP who sits on the Brexit steering group in the European Parliament. Is the EU ready to deal with potential Brexit chaos? Danuta HUBNER in Brussels, welcome to Hard Talk.
Welcome to you as well.
I talked about the fateful decision facing the British Parliament. How closely are you and others at the heart of power in Brussels watching the events unfold in the UK right now?
Well, we have been, I think, watching, I can say safely, what's going on in UK from the very beginning of this, first of all, of this announcement back many years ago of the future referendum, then also the deal with Mr. Cameron in February 2016, and then, of course, the referendum, which was a big, bad surprise to me personally, and then, of course, the notification, and then we organized also ourselves in the Parliament in such a way that we could not only follow, but also contribute to the negotiations. We have been also briefed basically weekly by Michel Barnier, the chief EU negotiator, on the progress in the negotiations, on the challenges in the negotiations. We have involved through a special structure which is called Brexit Steering Group. We have involved all five major political groups in the European Parliament in this process of being part of the Brexit negotiations with a view to build a constructive body, a constructive majority for the future vote on the deal once it's finalized, which is actually the situation today.
Just a few days ago, Theresa May and the EU 27 leaders agreed on the withdrawal agreement, treaty it's going to be, and they also agreed on a framework for the future relationship between the EU 27 and Britain. After that deal was done, Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the Commission, said, "This is the best deal possible. In fact, this is the only deal possible." We're not to take him entirely seriously, are we?
Well, I think one should take it seriously because after all the negotiations, actually we have reached an agreement. And if you look at our watches, if we look at them, we can see that the time is really disappearing actually very quickly, and we have very limited time now to finalize the whole process. And you can see on the basis of what's going on now in UK that it is a process, the political element, the discussion, the approval or rejection of the deal. And also on our side, we need to go through the procedure, which requires also some months. So we are actually in a moment where we cannot waste more time, and we cannot imagine that there can be something which is called going back to the table and renegotiate anything. I don't think that Mr. Juncker has exaggerated. I think there is nothing hidden as a plan B here.
You say nothing hidden, no plan B, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. But given the sensitivity of the time, and as you say, the clock is ticking and everything now needs to happen very quickly, how wise do you think it was for Emmanuel Macron, the French president, right after the signing of the deal at leadership level, how wise was it for him to come out and tell Europe's press that, in his view, France and the EU now had a major lever which they could use over Britain? He described the backstop arrangement by which the British will stay in a customs union if there is no future agreement on a trade relationship by December 2020. He described that backstop arrangement, indefinite arrangement, as a tool and a lever which would ensure that France got what it wanted on fisheries, for example. That was very damaging, wasn't it?
You know, when you think back the last 2 years, and if you remember what politicians said for the home purpose of coping, or when we're talking to the public at home, that a lot of unnecessary things have been said. And I think this language of using every opportunity to speak to our own electorates, to our own public, I think sometimes is also damaging, because today, when you speak, hear something immediately on the other continent, they also know the same thing in the same moment. So yes, I think certain things are definitely unnecessary. And especially that I think there is we have been avoiding up to now this trade-off approach, and we have never linked anything to the other thing. So I don't think this is the spirit of the negotiations that have been so far maintained, and I trust it will be also maintained in the future.
But I guess, forgive me for interrupting, but I guess what I'm getting to is the point that many people in Britain who support what is called a hard Brexit, and I could think of people like Boris Johnson, the former UK Foreign Secretary, whom you know well, Jacob Rees-Mogg and others, they describe the deal that has been done by Theresa May as a form of capitulation, a form of surrender. They use this word vassalage to indicate that the EU will retain power and control over many aspects of Britain's economy and Britain's life, with Britain having no say in the future at the EU table. Can you, as a Pole, and of course the Poles have their own scepticism about elements of the European Union, can you understand that concern that there is in Britain today?
Well, you know, we have been responding. I also personally have invested a lot of my time in the whole process to make this process really as friendly as possible, as a process of separation of two sides that have had good times in the past and that would like to have also a very deep, close relationship in the future. And I think that we have to maintain this, absolutely, this spirit. But also what we could hear, and I would say maybe in particular from the British politicians very often, the comments which were very far from the reality, which have been even ignoring the way the European Union functions and is structured. There have been a lot of intention also, which I think are necessary to force the community of, it will be 440 probably million inhabitants once UK will leave, to change the rules on which we have built our unity and our functioning, our single market, our customs union. So I guess that the time has come now that the politicians would just really start talking to people seriously about the consequences of no deal, and about also understanding and explaining to the people the deal that is really on those 585 pages or 20-something pages of the political declaration. I think people would be surprised that a lot of things which are presented there to them are not really reality which is in this deal. So I don't think that there...
Well, let's strip away any misinformation and let's get down to reality. Ms. Hubner, you will know as well as I do that the mathematics for Theresa May at the moment looks terrible. It looks very, very difficult for her to win a majority in the House of Commons for this deal. So I would imagine you would agree that it's incumbent upon the EU side as well as the British side to begin to think about what will happen if the UK Parliament rejects the deal. Now, there are various propositions for a renegotiation of the agreement. Are you telling me that it's too late for any renegotiation, or is there room for more talk?
Well, all I can say is probably repeat what has been said over the last days on our side by all the leaders at the European institutions level, but also at national level, that we have finalized the negotiations. And what we discussed already, this question of the no time to start from scratch, and also this is something which both sides have to take seriously. We have managed to convince our 27 member states. Not all of them were very happy with everything that is in the deal. We have managed to convince them that this is a deal that we have to accept as an offer also to the by Prime Minister, to the public and to the politicians in London. But I'm sorry, but yeah?
Well, I can see that it would be very difficult at this point to unpick the binding withdrawal agreement, which ultimately will take treaty form. That would be very difficult, but it would be much less difficult to change the wording of the declaration on the future relationship. There are people in the UK who are now saying what we need is a much clearer vision for the future, whether it be to go to what's being called a Norway Plus solution, which would see Britain in the European free trade area. That's what some of the more soft Brexiteers would like to see, or indeed a nod towards a Canada Plus supersized free trade agreement, which is what people like Boris Johnson would like to see. Either way, surely there is still time to change the wording on the declaration about the future relationship.
But you know, it's not only about changing the wording in the declaration. This is a completely different concept. And so far, you might remember from the day one of this whole process of leaving the European Union, the UK has been very clear on what we call the red lines. So we heard so many times, and it was just something repeated by everybody, that the UK definitely will leave the single market, which is the Norway or EEA solution, that UK will leave the customs union, that UK was actually presenting the red lines and conditions.
Yeah, but my point is everything has to be on the table because Britain's in political chaos. There is a total meltdown crisis in the UK. It's quite possible that after December 11th, there will be a majority in the House of Commons to push forward a Norway Plus solution, which would involve the European free trade area, would involve Britain playing by the rules of the single market. I guess what I need to hear from you is whether you're prepared to even consider that.
But you know, I think we shouldn't discuss it unless we maybe reach such a moment and there will be a political crisis. Then we, of course, both sides will have to sit together and to see whether we can still do anything for UK, as the spirit of European Union is exactly to have good relations with the neighbors also, and never ever just aim at punishing or making somebody's life difficult. But we also have our rules, and we also have our limits when it comes to the solutions offered to third countries. And we also have these time limits, and we also have behind us the negotiations that have led, I would say, to some sort of Brexit fatigue on this side, because we have also other things to do.
Believe me, I understand Brexit fatigue, so I want to keep my questions as simple as possible and your answers. Simple question. Would you consider, I mean, you have an important post at the European Parliament. Would you and the Brussels powers consider extending the deadline beyond March 29th to give Britain, with all of its political chaos, more time to sort out what it really wants?
But, you know, I think, yes, this possibility exists, but this possibility would have, of course, very strict rules that would have to be respected. But can you imagine, in the current political situation in UK, that there will be an agreement of staying longer in the European Union, when we had heard so many times that just 29th of March, 11 p.m. and not a second more. So it's very difficult to imagine that this kind of request could come from UK. That's what I'm saying, that any new situation, I think, will be certainly not welcome probably, but met with an open attitude and goodwill on our side, and good faith also. But let's hope that we don't reach that stage where you will have to test our readiness to go back to the negotiation table. I still think that Mrs. May will have. Can I just say one more thing? Because I believe that if Mrs. May could depersonalize this agreement and make it really an agreement which is a UK agreement, then I think maybe also other politicians would feel the responsibility for the future of the British citizens and businesses, and find agreement which is proposed in agreement with the UK government acceptable.
I find it interesting that you say that you believe that it is possible the EU side would consider extending the deadline, in essence, suspending the deadline in the Article 50 two-year rule. That's interesting, because many British politicians are now thinking, for example, that Britain might need to go through a general election or even a second Brexit or EU in or out referendum. Now, I wonder whether any politicians of the ruling Conservative Party or the opposition Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats or the Scottish Nationalists, have they been talking to you about the possibility of a second referendum and about the need, therefore, to extend the deadline?
Well, you know, the deadline extension has been, I think, from the very beginning as a possibility, because that is also in the European Parliament resolution that we can imagine this, but this would require unanimity on the side of the European Union. So you would have 27 leaders and 27 member states willing to do so, and it would require also the request coming, justified request coming from UK to do it. But I'm not saying that it is absolutely possible to do. This would be also a political, I don't want to use the word gesture, but probably a political gesture is the right word to, but clearly justified. And I can imagine that it would be maybe more imaginable if that just happened by default and not due to political problems, because those political problems would have been solved already months, if not years ago.
Have you spoken to any British politicians about it?
Yes, I think many people, you know, I had hundreds of meetings over the last 2 years because
I mean, forgive me, but I mean in the last week. It's now, it's D-Day, it's the moment of truth in Britain. I just wonder if British politicians are talking to you about different scenarios right now.
I didn't meet anybody with this request who is responsible for decision-making on the UK side. This I can say. But of course there are many citizens, many organizations that are coming to us, many also probably we could think of politicians coming also from more devolved territories than from London. But of course nobody talks officially to us, nobody who is in power to make this type of decision on behalf of the British government.
Right. Just, the more we talk and the more I hear you use words like flexibility and trying to make this work for both sides, the more I realize that Jean-Claude Juncker's statement, "This is the only deal," has to be taken with a pinch of salt. And it strikes me that Europe faces a grave crisis here too, not least because if Britain were to leave in a disorderly Brexit, some call it the crash-out Brexit, it would have grave consequences for the member states of the European Union, particularly Ireland, which could lose up to 3% or more of its GDP over the coming years, German exporters, the Dutch, who trade so much with the UK. The truth is that the EU membership, as well as Britain, can't really afford to countenance a disorderly no-deal Brexit.
I don't think that when Jean-Claude Juncker said, and then others repeated it, that that was something which is not reality. I think it is reality. There is no other deal today. There is no other deal to be offered to UK or to be renegotiated. But that's a different story from what we have been discussing, which is the extension of the Article 50, which of course would be limited because we have elections to European Parliament, as you might remember, a couple of months later after the UK leaves. So there would be limit even if that would be feasible. But what is, I hope, a common approach, but definitely it's European approach, that the most undesirable outcome of this process would be a no-deal scenario. It's even hard to imagine the consequences of this, especially for UK, but not only. There's still some politicians in UK who believe that no deal would be also a negotiated scenario. No deal is just nothing with regard to citizens, which we negotiated, nothing with regard to with regard to the Irish border, no transition period. The crash out, as you say, just overnight, and all the dramatic consequences for not only for citizens but also for businesses, hence also for the economy. So yes, we are against this scenario.
Yes, of course you're against it, but again, isn't the truth somewhat different from the way you present it? You say, oh, the crash-out Brexit would lead to all of this disaster in terms of, for example, the rights of Polish citizens in the UK, of which there are 1 million or more.
I was thinking also of British citizens in Europe, because
I mean, the truth is that if there really were to be a no-deal Brexit, in the last weeks before it actually happened, surely EU officials would get together with British officials and make sure that there were ad hoc arrangements to ensure that the planes kept flying, the ports remained open, that Poles could still work in the UK and British citizens could still work in Poland. Ad hoc arrangements would be made. So in a sense, you're scaring people, aren't you?
No, quite the contrary. We are thinking that this is something that we have to take into account, like the Brits also have taken into account. We have to be prepared to avoid these dramatic consequences for people, for businesses. That's why we are waiting in our hands with all the preparedness for this, all the contingency planning for this, and the most undesirable outcome of the whole process till we have the ratification document in our hands, and then we can just stop preparing, because otherwise we would have to prepare to sort of defend, to protect the citizens, protect the businesses as much as we can. But I think first of all we must do everything exactly to avoid this scenario to take place, because it's inevitable. If we don't have agreement on time, then we can't change the European treaties, we can't change the British laws, so there will be consequences of this.
There are some things you can't prepare for, and I'm thinking in particular of Poland's case, because of course you're a former Polish government minister, former Polish EU commissioner. The British share of the EU budget amounts to something like 15%. Now, they've promised as part of the agreement to pay 39 billion in terms of their obligations and dues to the EU as part of the divorce settlement. But if the deal isn't ratified and Britain crashes out of the EU, the British government isn't going to give you the 39 billion euros, and a government like Poland, which relies on EU money in so many different ways, is going to be thrown into crisis.
But just let me say two things. One is, of course, that British are not paying a fee of separation or divorce. The British contribution to the EU budget would be linked to, first of all, to the programs, projects in which research, among other things, Erasmus, among other things. There will be continuation of all the programs related to, during the transition till the end of the financial perspective, related also to the common agricultural policy.
You can dress it up any way you want, but I think it's quite plain that if Britain crashes out of the EU, you won't be getting your 39 billion euros.
So that's one thing. And the other thing is, of course, if we have a no-deal scenario, then we are fully aware that there will be no contribution of EU to the budget. And you might be surprised, listening also to this Polish government, which is not my government, saying that they are prepared to pay more to the EU budget to maintain the policies which Poland benefits from.
So in your view, the EU could withstand all of the problems, challenges and pressure that would come with a crash-out, disorderly Brexit?
Well, both sides would be affected. That's absolutely clear. As you can imagine, we have also in UK, but also on the continent, we have altogether, I think, more than 28 million small and medium-sized companies which have not prepared like the big financial firms. That they never functioned even outside single market. They never functioned outside the customs union. So yes, it will be a very difficult situation for many businesses, also for citizens. We can have emergency measures that would help in the short run, but we would have to be prepared that soon those emergency measures will stop to be applied, and we will move to a third country regime for UK or for our relations with UK. So yes, the cost, this is a process which costs, it's obvious, and it will cost much more, and we have the capacity as politicians, the responsibility to avoid this.
Last question.
No deal is not, yeah?
Yeah, last question. It's personal and it's emotional. You've known Britain for a long time, long experience of working with the British. Are you feeling very angry toward the British today?
We respect the decision. We regret it very much, and I'm certainly among those people who regret it probably above the average. So yes, I am angry. I regret it, and I cannot understand. And I also hope that those who might wish to create a hard Brexit, a crash out, that they will understand the consequences for the generations of the Brits, of other Europeans. So I think our duty is, first of all, to find an agreement that would allow us to have an orderly Brexit. No important how sad nonsense actually it is for me.
Danuta HUBNER, I thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.